Hello everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of tutorials I'll be making on how to create full-stack web applications using Spring and AngularJS. My name is Christopher Henkel, and I'm a software developer specializing in Java, although I've used a number of different languages and technologies. I've worked on a number of commercial projects, and I'm also the co-founder of a company called iRocket Apps, where we create mobile games and applications. In this series of tutorials, I'll assume you have an intermediate to expert understanding of Java, and that and the focus and that you have some experience with HTML and JavaScript. The overall focus of the tutorial will be the creation of an application that highlights a lot of the features that you would imagine having in a production application, such as authentication, authorization, transaction management, object relational mapping, and different things like that. So I'm going to be building my projects using Maven, so you should be able to follow along in any editor or IDE that you like. I'm going to start off by creating a new project here in IntelliJ IDEA, and I'm going to create a Maven project. I'm going to call it Basic Web App. Now this will form the basis, the foundation for later tutorials. Now, IntelliJ IDEA will create something pretty bare bones for us. It will create a POM file, and it will create a standard Maven directory structure. And we're going to specify here that we're going to specify packaging of war since we're making a web application. And now we're also going to specify a dependency management section to make sure we're getting consistent versions of Spring modules. So first you're going to search Spring documentation, and then you're going to go to the Spring Framework project homepage, and then you're going to get the 4.0.5 reference documentation. Now you're going to search Bill of Materials, and this Bill of Materials is going to specify a dependency management section for us. Basically, this will specify the different versions of Spring modules that will be included in our current project and also in transient dependencies, so that we're using consistent versions of Spring no matter what we decide to include in our project. For example, Spring Security has a different release schedule than other Spring modules, so it may depend on older versions of Spring, and we might get a transient dependency to a different version of a Spring module than the other versions of Spring modules, in which case it can create program instability. So we like to add this dependency management section to make sure we're getting consistent versions across the board. Now we also want to specify a dependencies section in here, and we're going to specify a couple dependencies. The first dependency we'll include is pretty standard. It's the Spring context dependency, which includes a number of Spring modules as transient dependencies, and things you just need for dependency injection and different things like that. Now the second module that we're going to include, and Spring context also includes stuff to just get Spring running in the first place. So the next thing we'll need is the Spring Web MVC module, and this will give us a dispatcher servlet, which will act as a front controller in an MVC pattern that Spring provides, and it will also provide us with controller annotations so that Spring can find our controllers and basically so we can create an MVC style application. So you're going to include Spring -web MVC here, and the other thing we'll need a build clause, and we'll need to have a plugins clause, and we're going to include a couple plugins here. One of the plugins we're going to define here is included by default, but it has some incorrect configuration. The Maven includes a Java compiler plugin by default, and it compiles with a source and target of Java 1.5, and we want to specify a source and target of 1.6. So if you go to Google and you search Maven compiler plugin, you should be able to find this here, the first link, and you click that, and you go to setting the source and target of the Java compiler. Over here, you'll see something very similar to what we need. We have a plugin here with configures the compiler plugin. You want to copy that and place that in your code, and change the source and target to 1.6. So that should configure the Maven compiler plugin for our project. The next thing we need is a plugin for a Tomcat embedded servlet container. So you'll want to go to Google and search Tomcat embedded plugin. Click on the first link and click version 2.2, and then go to here we are. So you'll want this in your POM file. We're going to use Tomcat 7 because that uses JSP and servlet API that's consistent with the Spring version we're using. Spring and VC 4.0.5 will use servlet spec 3.0 and JSP spec 2.2, which means we'll need an Apache version of 7.0 or greater. So copy in the Tomcat 7 plugin into our project here. And so now that should actually be enough that we can actually start the server. However, we haven't actually created a web application descriptor file, or a number of files we'll need to actually create a working application. But one thing we want to do before we continue is we want to make sure that external dependencies such as Spring Context and WebMVC and Tomcat 7 are being imported by default, and by default IntelliJ IDEA does not import those plugins. So you need to go to File here and then go to Settings, and then under Maven go to Importing, and then click Import Maven Projects Automatically. Click Apply and then click OK, and you'll notice that Tomcat 7 imports on the side here, so now we have access to all of the plugin functions, and over on here on the left we have the different Spring dependencies that we included. Now if we run this application, it should start up the server and without bugs, but we don't have anything configured, so nothing will happen if we go to our context path. So we're going to stop the execution of a server, and we're going to create a web app directory, which is a standard directory in Maven, which contains our web resources. So we're going to go to main here, and we're going to create a new directory called web app, and inside that is where we will store our webinf directory, which is a standard directory that servlet containers will look for when trying to find the web application descriptor file, which will be called web.xml. Now, we could just type web app here and create our application like that, but I'm going to include a namespace so that we have some code completion, and we also verify that it's a properly formed XML file. So if you go to Spring Docs and you search web-app, you'll find different web application descriptor tags, but you'll want this one, which doesn't have any typos. One of the ones in this particular document have a typo, but you'll want this one, and just paste that in here, and now we should have a web application descriptor file that has code completion. So we can write servlet here and create a servlet, or we can create a servlet mapping. We'll need to create both a servlet and a servlet mapping in order to create an MVC application here. So the first, so we'll want to create a front controller. We'll create a servlet that will map to Spring's dispatcher servlet. So we're going to call this MVC dispatcher, and Spring will use this front controller to map requests to our controllers. So we're going to call it MVC dispatcher, and the class we'll be using will be org.springframework.web.servlet.dispatcher-servlet. And we'll map this particular servlet to accept URLs, any kind of URL, so that all requests are mapped to as dispatcher servlet. So we want to create a servlet mapping, and we'll specify an MVC dispatcher here, so a name of MVC dispatcher, so it maps to the servlet we just created, and a URL pattern of /, which will basically accept all URLs coming in from the site. So that configures our web application context for Spring MVC. The next thing we'll need to do is create a configuration file for our web MVC project. And by default, Spring will look for a Spring Bean XML file that has the name MVC-dispatcher-servlet.xml inside the webinf directory, and it will be this name -servlet.xml. So we want to create that file in our webinf directory. We're going to call it MVC-dispatcher-servlet.xml. And inside here, we want to have a standard, we would like to use the Beans namespace provided by Spring so that we have code completion and we also know it's well formed. So search for MVC : and we should find this tag here. This file is actually pretty similar to the one we'll be creating. We're going to copy in this tag here so we have the correct namespaces, and we'll also want to add one additional namespace, which will be the context namespace, and we'll use that for actually scanning different components. So I copied the MVC tag here, the MVC tag, and I'm going to replace all references of MVC to context for that copy and paste. And also for the location, the XML location, I'll need to have that defined down here. So I'm going to copy the one for MVC and replace all instances of MVC with context. And finally, I'm going to use the context namespace to scan for components in a package we'll create. So I'm going to write context component scan, and then I'm going to set the base package to tutorial.mvc, which is where we will store our components, our controllers. And we're also going to want to use MVC annotation driven so that Spring looks for the controller annotations and recognizes them as controllers. The other thing we'll need an internal resource view resolver so Spring can map the views that it returns to files. So you'll want to search the documentation for internal resource view resolver, and you'll find over here, for example, is one way of creating an internal resource view resolver. However, if they use a JSTL view, we're just going to use a standard view, the default view class, which is a JSP view, so we don't have to include the JSTL tag library. So copy in this into here and erase this so that the default JSP view is used. And also make a directory where we will store our views. The internal resource view resolver will look for files in the JSP directory under webinf. So we'll want to create a directory in here, JSP, and we'll store our view in there. We'll call it view.jsp, and we'll write out some text like hello world. And the other thing we'll need a controller to map a request coming into the site so that it generates that view. So and that controller has to be in the tutorial.mvc package so Spring can find it. So create a new Java class here and call it test controller. And we'll specify a package of tutorial.mvc. And we'll want to annotate this controller with the controller mapping here. And we'll also want to create a function that returns the view name. So public string test return view. Now the internal resource view resolver will see this as a view name and map it to the view.jsp file in the JSP directory. Now, the only thing left to do is map this function to a URL relative to the context path. And in order to do that, we use something called a request mapping annotation. And we specify /test here. So any URL request that comes into context path /test will execute this function and return the view. So if we set up everything correctly now, the program should run. I'm going to double click Tomcat 7 run over here to run our application. And our servlet container starts, and we can go to localhost 8080/basic web app/test. And if everything works properly, we should see our view here. And so everything is working properly. Our view is properly resolved. And so we created a basic Spring Web MVC application. And this will form the basis for later tutorials. Instead of having Spring generate a view for us, we're going to be creating RESTful services, and AngularJS is going to grab the data from those RESTful services to create the views on the client side. But most of the code in this tutorial we'll be using in future tutorials. Like and subscribe this video if you found this helpful, and thank you for watching.